Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in this video we're going to go over the useReducer hook. So let's just recap all the hooks that we've learned so far. And again, a hook are these functions that always start with the word use. So there was useState, which is used to create a piece of state, again a little piece of data that's reactive, which could be anything. We've used useEffect, which is how we did lifecycle functions. So that way you can create a structure that runs certain processes at the time that the component mounts, when certain pieces of data update, or when the component is removed from the screen. Okay, so that's what the useEffect hook did. And then we also talked about useContext, which allowed us to grab the data that a context provider is providing us from a component in that particular component tree. Okay, so the last sort of major hook that I wanted to talk about is useReducer. What useReducer does is that it allows you to manage your state in a different way. So instead of using useState, which allows you to directly change the state using a setState function. So in this case, we had like, for each piece of state, we named it differently: set count, set test, set to do. But the idea is you don't have the set function that directly sets the value of that state. Instead, what's going to happen is that you're going to have a dispatch function. In that dispatch function, you're going to pass an action to. Typically, the action is an object that has at least two properties: action, type, and payload. Type is the type of action you're taking, and payload is any kind of extra information you need for the purposes of your state changes. That dispatch function will take the action that's passed to it and then pass it to what's called a reducer function. And the reducer function will take that information, do stuff, and then return the new state. So in the case here, the idea here is that your state is not the product of you just saying, this is my state. It's a result, it's a response to what's going on in your app. Okay, so there's a little bit of boilerplate setup to use this sort of the standard conventional way. It's pretty flexible. You can use it in other ways if you wish. But what we're going to do is we're going to start off by just creating the basic boilerplate. So what you're going to want to do is in your source folder, let's create a reducer.js. Okay, and there's going to be a couple things we want to make here. We're going to want to first create a initial state. An initial state is essentially where our state's going to start out as, because we're going to have a special piece of state that this reducer creates. So you can have lots of information, a little bit of information, whatever you want. So we're going to export initial state. This is just going to be an object with the property of count, which is 0. Okay, always building a counter is always kind of the easiest way to start. And why is it? I had to put const. Whenever you use export, you actually have to declare the thing you're exporting. Okay, and then we also need to export the reducer function. That's going to be the function that the action gets paid to. Okay, so our reducer function. So const reducer equals, and the reducer is always going to get two things. Okay, it's always going to get the state. So it always has the current existing state, and also gets the action. And always let me double check that. I always get confused of which order those two are in. useReducer hook. Okay. Doop-a-doop-a-doo, reducer. Yep, it's the state, then the action. Okay, just always like to double check. Cool. So the simplest way to do this, again, creating a counter, typically what happens, again, action is typically going to be an object. So action usually is going to equal some sort of object that looks like this. There's going to be a property called type that's going to have a string for what type of action it is, and it's going to have a payload, which could be literally anything. Okay, and this will just be some sort of value. Okay, cool. So we're going to assume that our reducer is going to get this object. Where it's going to get it from, we don't know yet. But this reducer function is going to get that object, and then it's going to return the new state. So typically what you do is you create a switch. So switch, and the thing we're testing is the type of action. So action.type is sort of what's being passed into the switch. Again, we're creating a counter. So we're going to keep this real simple. So basically, we're going to say one type of action is add. We're going to add. And in that case, what it's going to return, okay, is a new object that has the existing state. So again, imagine you had like 50 different properties in your state. You're not going to write out each individual property. So we always use a spread operator to include the existing state. And then after we include the state as is, we override any properties we need to override. So I'm going to say count is now going to equal state.count, the current state's count, plus action.payload. Because here we're going to assume that we're going to increase it by whatever the payload is. So that action object is telling us really everything the reducer needs to make the appropriate changes to state. Okay, and then we're going to break. Okay, case, we'll say sub for subtract. And if you're wondering, this is technically the way Redux works, which is a separate library. That's what useReducer is based on. It's based on the pattern that Redux introduced that became really popular for managing app-wide state, because people got tired of passing everything as props. So people, what they do is they would create these large objects outside of their application and use Redux to manage it. That's essentially what we could do here. So we could theoretically put all of our application logic in this object here, and then just create cases for every possible scenario in which we'd want to change the state, and then just pass the appropriate action. Okay, so sub, we're just going to subtract, so I'm just going to literally do the same thing. So we're just going to return this, except now it's going to be minus the payload. And we're going to break. Okay, and so there's a lot of boilerplate setup. Things get quicker once it's all set up. Default. Okay, default, and then we just return the state. So usually for your default, you just return the state, because then we're assuming that the state did not change if there's no action. Okay, or it's not one of the defined actions. Okay, so that's that. Okay, so we defined our initial state and our reducer. So that exists, that's a thing. So now we're going to go back to our app component. So let's go back to components and go to app. And we're going to import those things. So I'm going to import, and again, since I use a normal named export, I have to destructure them. So I'm going to destructure initial state, and I'm going to destructure the reducer from, this is in the parent folder, so it's / reducer. Cool. So we have these things. So now inside my app component, that's where I'm going to create this thing. Okay. And basically we're going to get back the state. Okay. And we're going to get back, so basically our initial state gets passed back to us. That's going to be in that state variable. And we're going to get back a dispatch function. Okay. And that dispatch function is what we're going to use to trigger that reducer function. And that's going to equal React.useReducer. And that we're going to pass, there we have to pass the reducer first, then the initial state. That's the way I remember. I always remember that it's backwards. So state and dispatch goes in that direction, and here so essentially state's always on the outside. State, and then these two relate to each other. Okay, cool. Okay, so now we have this thing. And remember, we have this context provider that we created in the previous video. So typically what you would do with your dispatch function is that the point of useReducer is to kind of make it where you can manage your entire application state from that reducer using that one state object. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to change the value from this hello variable, and instead we're going to pass in an object. Actually, we can keep hello in there, so just so it doesn't break anything. But we're now going to also include state and dispatch. So now any component that is getting my context will now be able to also grab state and dispatch. Okay, and if I remember right, we passed that over to grandchild. So let's build out the rest of this in grandchild. So basically, we're creating this piece of state here, but again, instead of a set state function, we're getting this dispatch function. That's the difference. So you're still getting a state variable. Your component's still going to re-render every time that state changes, but the difference is instead of directly changing the state with set state, you're going to trigger the reducer function using dispatch, and then reducer will return the new state based on the action. Okay, cool. So let's go to grandchild. So again, grandchild is getting the context. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another h1 with the count. So again, the context has the count, so we can grab it from there. Context.state dot count. Okay, and that needs curly brackets. Okay, and then we're going to want to create buttons. So we're going to create a button to add. So I'm going to just do on click, and then when you click this button, an arrow function will run. And all this arrow function does is that it's going to run the dispatch function. So context dot dispatch, and then inside the dispatch function we're going to pass the action. Okay, and the action again is always an object with two properties. Type, this is the one we're going to add, so we have to put add. And payload, we're just going to put a number, so I'm going to say we're going to add 1. Okay, because that's the way we set up our reducer function. So that dispatch function is going to pass this action object to our reducer function. That's all it does. And then the reducer function returns the new state. So I'm just going to make this button again, just literally the same exact button. And then this time I say the action is sub, and the payload is still 1. Okay, save. Okay, so again, all I know, so when I'm reading the code, all I can see here is that I know that this what I'm doing is I'm adding. So in this case, the actual data change, I would have to go look at the reducer to see what it is, but I can have a more sort of semantic by looking at the action. When I read the code, I have a more idea of like sort of what action it's taking. And then I can go over there, look at the switch, find the right action, and see what the changes to my state are. Instead of all this logic that's all around my app, I have all my state change logic in the reducer. And all I'm doing is I'm just saying, okay, well, when this happens, pass in this action. When this happens, this action, this payload, and then the reducer figures out the rest. The reducer actually makes the changes to state based on those parameters. So we're programmatically, and let me just change the name of the button. Okay, so let's run this. Let's open this up in, so npm run dev to run the dev version. What's it complaining about? Oh yeah, I deleted the node modules folder. So I need to type in npm install again. So let's install all the dependencies because they're already in the package.json. Perfect. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is do npm run dev. And again, I'm just running one of the two scripts. So when I do npm run, I'm saying run one of the scripts in the package.json. And see, I have 3 scripts here. The only 2 that really matter are dev and build. So dev is what we use when we're developing, so that creates that updating server. And then build is going to build our final version, really for when we want to deploy it. That would be our build command, npm run build. Okay. So we'll be reused by task, press any key to close it. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it's doing the thing. So it didn't open it, did it? Make it Control C. What am I looking at here? Okay, npm run dev. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we see those so this is the that count variable from our reducer, our initial state. So it started at 0, and then these are our 2 buttons. So now when I click add, see it adds 1. Because when I click the add button, it's running that dispatch function, which is passing that action object to the reducer function which is running through that switch, it hits the add portion of the switch and then adds 1. So let's just like, and then again, let me go take a look at my dev tools, Control Shift I, components, and I can see here, see if I go see the context here, see I see there's a reducer hook, and see like that's the state from reducer. So see that state is in my app. Okay, so that state is in my app component. And then every time I hit add, see that's where it's changing. Add 2, 3, 4, see it's changing here in app. Okay. But now I also have the context hook, which is allowing me to pass that stuff all the way. So see, I'm grabbing the dispatch function via the context hook. Okay, so that's how I ended up getting this information. And that's how I'm able to use that dispatch function here in the grandchild and make changes to that state, even though that state exists in app. So theoretically, I could have all my information exist in that one object, yet make it available and make it available to use throughout my entire application. Okay, you know, I can basically pass the dispatch function and the state to whatever component using context, and then they can make the changes they need by passing in the right action, and then they can grab the values they need from that state object because they just grab it from context. So that pattern allows you to kind of literally store all your information in one place, which, you know, there's trade-offs. Because you're storing all your state in app, pretty much everything is still going to re-render. Like, let's take a look at the console here. So if I type in, no, actually not here, elements. So let me just collapse everything. Okay, and let's see what's updating every time I hit the up button. So again, you'll see like a little flash when something updates. Okay, Virtual DOM is pretty good. Okay, so see, Virtual DOM is still only changing this. So it's still figuring it out. I guess so it's not the end of the world. It's not forcing a complete re-render of the whole component, even though the data lives in app, but it can. And that's always sort of the thing you got to be careful for when you're deciding, okay, how am I going to manage my state? So luckily, like, React has that virtual DOM thing under the hood that's really comparing the differences, making sure that's only really making the necessary changes. And then the other trade-off is encapsulation. Because you put all your state in one place, well, then your other components aren't necessarily as reusable in future applications. But if that's not something you care about, then that's not a problem. So that's the useReducer hook. It's just another way of managing state. Again, instead of setting the state directly, you're passing an action. So going back to the code. So see the button uses the dispatch function, which we pass down through with context. That dispatch function is going to end up passing that action object to our reducer function, which we defined. That reducer, that we had an action, a type property in that object. It checks that against different possibilities, different cases in our switch, sees that it's add, and then it returns a new object that represents the new state. Okay, and then that's essentially how useReducer works. That's all useReducer does. And if you understand that, you technically now understand Redux. That's literally what Redux does. The only difference is the Redux setup can be a little bit more involved, but this was pretty much the same thing. And again, this is not the only way you can use Reducer, but the idea here is that you're using useReducer almost in the way you would use Redux. So that way, if you did use Redux later on, you'll notice that this pattern seems very, very familiar. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.